Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Seth, Treasurer of Mental Hockey Club, and I'm joined by Andrew, our Welfare Officer, and James, our President, and Kenny from Student Wellbeing and Support. So today we're just gonna have a little talk, and the purpose of this talk is to kickstart the discussion of mental health and try and reduce the stigma around it. The way it's going to work is Kenny's just going to give a half an hour talk about his own experiences within mental health and kind of his career path and how he's got to where he is today. And then we're going to have a short 2 or 3 minute break and then open it up to the floor and have a bit of a Q&A with you guys. So please feel free to send in your questions to any of us or pop them in the chat, and Kenny will be happy to answer them at the end. As James said in the chat, this meeting is being recorded, so obviously please feel free to have your cameras off, but it would be lovely to see off your faces, so please do turn them on if you feel comfortable. And so yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it. Without further ado, Kenny, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me here, talking about something that is very important to me. So I did sort of say to the guys earlier that if anyone here was at the talk I did for Medics in November, then I do apologise, because you would have heard some of this already. My anecdotes might feel a little less fresh the second time around, but hopefully it'll be different enough to still be useful and hopefully even interesting. But to start with, I think it could be useful to briefly talk about what mental health is. And I don't want to patronize anyone. I appreciate it's a very common topic, and it's very sort of the moment in terms of being, you read about it in newspapers and online all over the place. It is a conversation that is happening, and that's great. But I think just sort of very briefly, it can be helpful to consider, and there are some, differing opinions on this, but I think it can be helpful to consider mental health as having 3 key elements. And one of those would be our social well-being, which focuses on our ability to be a part of and contribute to the world around us. And I'll only mention this very briefly because I think it's so dependent on the other 2 parts, one of which being our emotional well-being. And that's really how we're actually feeling and managing our life satisfaction, how happy and motivated we are, how we feel within ourselves day to day. And the third would be our psychological well-being. And positive psychological well-being essentially allows us to handle things going wrong, bounce back when things affect us, deal with the stresses of life. And that's, I think, where mental illness comes in, and mental health issues can impact upon our psychological well-being if not properly treated or managed. Having a diagnosable mental health issue does not necessarily mean you have poor mental health. If properly managed and treated, you can actually have a great state of mental health, despite having a mental health issue, whether common or complex. And having no mental health issue doesn't necessarily mean that you have good mental health, because if you don't look after yourself, if you get stuck in a rut, you can end up having very poor social and emotional well-being, despite potentially having a clean bill of health psychologically. And I suppose you can think of it as mental health issues being like underlying health issues, like an immunity disorder, for example, and mental well-being being like your actual current state. And someone with an underlying health issue could have periods where they're healthy, periods when they're not. But of course, the underlying health issue can, of course, make things more difficult, particularly if it's not being treated. And I'm not going to talk a huge amount about how you can look after your own mental health and well-being. There's a wealth of information out there, both on the Students' Union webpage, the Student Support and Wellbeing web pages, and also provided by all sorts of organisations like the NHS and various mental health charities. If you Google how to look after my mental health, you could be reading for days. There's so much out there, which is great. But I think what I will be focusing on is really my perspectives of what it's like to open up and talk about mental health as a man, why I think that can sometimes be difficult, and also my own experiences of growing more comfortable with it over time and what helped me do so. To say a little bit about myself, I am a student support and wellbeing advisor in the mental health side of the disability, mental health and wellbeing team. And empathy has really been quite a key defining characteristic of my professional roles, my personal choices and my social behavior. And empathy is defined by Carl Rogers, who is one of the sort of predecessors of the more humanistic styles of counselling, as opposed to sort of the psychodynamics of times gone. He defines empathy as being able to step into somebody's world and walk around in it as if it's your own without losing the as if. So then you can step back into your own world, your own sort of frame of reference, and you can offer support and you can offer encouragement and comfort to that person, having seen things from their perspective. And I think a really key moment for me, which sort of set things in motion and had a really huge impact on my life from that point, was I was about 14 years old, and I was being driven home by a friend's dad from a party. And my friend said, you know, he was talking about one of the girls that was at the party, and he said, oh, you know, she was like crying half the night and then she left early. She's so dramatic. And his dad was like, well, I mean, it sounds like she was quite upset. You know, you're being a bit unfair. And he said, yeah, but the things that she was probably upset about, for all we know, she was probably crying about, you know, somebody wearing the same dress as her and getting more compliments than she did, or something stupid like that. And his dad said something that I'd never really considered before. And it kind of, like, I don't want to overstate it, but it kind of blew my mind. He said, well, regardless of what she was crying about or what you think she was crying about, that doesn't, you know, even if you think it's not, even if you think it's a silly reason, that doesn't mean it's not real emotion. And that really stuck with me, sort of sitting there as a 14-year-old boy in the back of this car, like, whoa. And I think that genuinely had a really big impact on how I sort of carried myself in social situations from that point on. And it really, really stuck with me. And I think maybe not immediately, but there was a time around there. And for a long time, I did know that I wanted to be a counsellor or something like it. And in terms of my route to where I am, I did psychology at university. When I was at uni, I was an SRA, or we call them RSAs, but the SRA equivalent. And I know that in some places that is quite a sort of discipline or a very social related role, but where I went to university, that was a very welfare related role. I was also a security guard at the campus bars and clubs. And although, again, that sounds like a very related role, at 4 a.m. when you're the only sober person in what feels like a sea of inebriation, that can very quickly become a welfare related role. I was a welfare officer at my students' union after graduating, or the equivalent of. And after graduating, I've worked in various universities in student support and various roles therein. And I always knew that I was heading towards counselling, but I wasn't in a particular rush. And I wanted to get some experience doing some other things. And a lot of that was in experience giving practical welfare support. But I did reach a point in my life where I was offering practical support and then referring students on for therapeutic support. And I realized that actually I wanted to be offering that therapeutic support. So that's when I trained as a counsellor. And while I was doing my training, I worked I worked as a supervisor for psychiatric patients in a hospital, sort of a one-to-one supervisor. And I'm now a counsellor at Royal Holloway and an advisor on the mental health and wellbeing team at UCL. And the reason I sort of talk through that, not only my roles now, but sort of my career progression today, it's obviously involved a lot of emotion. And I always thought the reason this suited me was because I always thought that I was very emotionally open. And at school, I was the rugby playing, shot putting, like quite popular guy. Not that popularity really means anything when you sort of leave school, but I was also the sensitive guy who talks about feelings. And I didn't realize for very, very long that it was never my own feelings. And I remember one particular moment I think I was about 23, and I'd recently broken up with my girlfriend at the time. And a friend of mine asked how I was and asked me if I wanted to talk about it. And I said, yeah, I'm all right, like, not too bad. And I didn't really respond to the offer of talking about it. And she reiterated it, and she said, because, it's just very clear to me that you're always the listener and you're never the speaker. And I was a few whiskeys down at that point. And I'm going to be honest, that comment sobered me up a bit just for a moment. But then, I don't know, I probably had another and moved on. But a few years later, something happened to me that expanded my self-awareness. And what that event actually was is another story for another day. But it helped me to realize that I was very open to talking about feelings as long as they weren't mine. And far more shocking for me to learn was that I was the guy who knew everything about my friends, the one who they felt comfortable sharing anything with, but none of my friends were that person for me. And that's not their fault, that was mine. None of my friends knew my innermost thoughts or struggles. I was the inner circle for a lot of people, but my inner circle was just me. And after realizing this, I sort of shared it with a few friends, and it was quite funny, these interactions, because to me, it was like this mind-blowing epiphany, but to them, it wasn't news at all. And they were like, yeah, dude, that's you. But I didn't want that to be me. And it had been my life for so many years, but as soon as I gained that level of self-awareness, it actually seemed quite unfair. It seemed quite one-sided. I was friendly with these people. We shared memories, we shared great times and exciting experiences, but they were making themselves vulnerable to me, laying themselves bare. And I was like, yeah, thank you, I'll take that. Oh yeah, good talk. But it's interesting that this feeling of unfairness, I had this feeling of unfairness from the side of the one being shared with. Perhaps it was almost like a guilt, because in the counseling room, I meet so many clients, usually young men, who it's like they're trying vulnerability for the first time with a friend, and they might share something with someone who doesn't reciprocate, and then they feel a bit embarrassed and perhaps avoidant of the relationship because they're uncomfortable, and it's like there's a power imbalance. They've given a part of themselves and not received anything in return, so it's almost like they don't feel quite whole. And in the counseling room, it's different because it's not supposed to be a reciprocal friendship. But in a friendship where you're supposed to meet as equals and offer what you receive, the imbalances can sometimes make people feel awkward. And I hadn't got that impression from many of my friends, thankfully, but it may have been there at times. Perhaps they'd allowed me to assume this role of the counseling friend, and allowed the fact that I didn't share in return, because I proved time and time again that I wasn't going to judge or think less of them. But what I can say is that despite this, when I did start opening up and sharing myself with my friends, the response and outcomes were purely positive. There was growth, and realized I could go deeper. And I didn't feel like less of a person. I actually felt like more of one. But I knew that I could share with these people because they had shared with me. And I think that's a really important point, which I will come back to. But in terms of people, and particularly men, finding it difficult to open up, it's something I've thought quite a lot about, and I've read a bunch about, and obviously I've had my own experiences. But I think it sort of starts with the fact that genuine human connection is everything. It's really, really important. It's wholesome, it's warming, it's good for your health. Genuine human connection, however, requires vulnerability, and vulnerability can be really scary. When you've got nothing to hide behind and you're allowing yourself to be truly seen in your fears, us being vulnerable is a fear of shame. The fear that if people truly see us, they wouldn't consider us worthy of love or connection. There's a really, really great talk about shame and vulnerability, and how they sort of interplay, by a woman called Brene Brown. I think she's a social work professor. It's definitely worth checking out. In fact, if you just look for Brene Brown on Google, everything that she talks about is worth checking out. But I think what keeps us from making these deep, laid bare connections which I'd really truly argue is what makes human existence worthwhile, is the fear that we're not worthy of it. And I think this can be true for anyone, but what makes it so much more difficult for some men is that our sense of worthiness is so tied up in the idea that we need to be strong, unwavering, steadfast, unemotional, that we think allowing ourselves to be vulnerable somehow makes us less worthy. And a fear of being unworthy is what makes it too scary to be vulnerable. So if we break that down and look at it a little bit closer, it's drilled into us from a young age that we need to be unemotional, we need to be strong and independent. And even if we've got a really great and forward-thinking family who tell us that's not the case, then we go to school and we're told it is, or we go, we spend time with certain friends or certain family members who tell us it is important. And these things are the conditions of our worthiness. And we can only feel vulnerable with others if we believe that we are worthy of love. But we worry that being vulnerable makes us more emotional and less strong. So then that would make us less worthy, which makes it more difficult to be vulnerable. It's like this annoying cycle. So the very thing that humans need to be able to do, which is allow themselves to be vulnerable with other humans, is the same thing preventing men from doing it. We're stuck in this impossible cycle where we want the confidence to be vulnerable. In order to have that, we need to believe we're worthy. In order to believe we're worthy, we need to be strong and unemotional. And if we're strong and unemotional, we think we can't be vulnerable. So where do we go from there? If we believe that we need to be these things, what is the fix for this? I think then when it comes to mental health, it's even harder because we feel like it makes us weaker. That whole cycle again is amplified. But mental health issues, I'd argue are as organic as physical health issues. I can see someone's linked to that talk by Brené Brown. It really is brilliant, and I really would recommend that one. So yeah, mental health issues, I'd argue are as organic as physical health issues. And I mean, does a broken leg make you weaker? I mean, like physically, yes, you would technically be weaker if you had a broken leg, but we wouldn't worry about anyone thinking we were weak because we were in a car crash or because we inherited a medical condition. But whether the causes are situational, environmental, genetic, or even drug related, we're still talking about brain chemistry, we're talking about neurotransmitters and hormones. So why don't men open up to their friends and their partners? I think all of the above, really. I think they feel they need to be the rocks, or at least to seem like them. And even if they think this shouldn't be the case and shouldn't need to be the case, they can feel trapped by the fact that the men around them might be keeping up appearances. So they do too. And why don't men go to therapy? I think men are in a bit of a bind because it's hard to open up to a female counsellor because they think they need to be strong in front of women. It's hard to open up to a male counsellor. I mean, that's even worse because they can't make themselves look weak in front of another man. This is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but when I was training as a counsellor and I had to have my own therapy, I kind of feel I nailed it by going for an old woman because you can tell grandma anything. But being vulnerable with others, it can feel like a leap of faith. If we believe it will be good for us, we know we should do it. We're worried, but then we're worried about how we'll feel. We might feel uncomfortable. We're worried about how we'll appear. We might appear weak. But the secret that doesn't seem to be shared enough, and it really shouldn't be a secret at all, is that it's not just the case that vulnerability isn't a weakness. Vulnerability is actually a strength. And it's powerful. And when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with others, what we learn very quickly is that it's not something that we do for others. It's not like, okay, you shared with me, so I'll share with you, and that's the only reason. Being vulnerable with others isn't for them, it's for us. And earlier, I was speaking about how it was unfair on my friends that they were vulnerable with me and I wasn't in return. And there is some truth to that. But I was looking at it the wrong way. They were looking at it the wrong way. And sometimes we can all look at it the wrong way. I mean, my friends hadn't been opening up to me for my sake, to give me these interesting bits of information and make me feel important. They were sharing with me because it helped them. It built them up. It helped them understand themselves better. And they were caring for themselves, loving themselves, and looking after their own well-being, and thankfully allowing me to be a part of that, using our friendship as a safe and healthy space to do that. But if it took me 24 years to realize that I needed to be vulnerable with my friends, initially thinking it was like a gift I could give them, it took me seconds after that to realize that the real gift was to myself. But also, it's not just about how we feel afterwards. I think vulnerability is also a strength because it shows strength. So, I mean, who seems stronger to you? A man who is supposedly so independent and self-sufficient that he never speaks one word about his issues and suffers in silence, or a man who can share with someone, share with a group, or stand on stage and share with an audience about his struggles, his losses, his pain? And then maybe the odd person who'd sit there and think, shouldn't this guy be able to deal with this himself? But surely most of us would think, wow, fair play. It takes guts to be that guy. I'm impressed. And I think sharing allows us to get the help we need and can make a real tangible difference to our lives. And I've had clients say to me that they're embarrassed they even need counseling. But pretty much everyone needs counseling. Even those who don't necessarily need it could still benefit from it. And who is managing better or showing strength and capability? The person who refuses to admit they need help, or even just that they need other people in their life because everyone does, or the person who recognizes it and then gets up and makes it happen. And societal opinion is changing slowly but surely. It sometimes seems that we're moving at a glacial pace, especially when you read in places like the National Review that men need to be men, need to avoid society's attempts to turn them into women. Like, shut up, right? This language is perhaps the most harmful thing for the collective well-being of men, and unfortunately the well-being and sometimes the safety of women too. And if we think about the language used to describe allowing yourself as a man to be vulnerable and to recognize, process, and accept your emotions, it is changing. You know, we might currently call it being a modern man, which perhaps isn't too bad. In the noughties, we called it being in touch with your feminine side. Not that the idea of being feminine should ever be a bad thing or used in a derogatory way, but this was clearly intended to be insulting or at least tongue in cheek. And we can't keep making out or allowing others to make out that to be in touch with your emotions is to be female. Because some of us aren't going to care about that, but some people, that is going to make it more difficult. Men need to be in touch with their emotions and know that they are still men, because men locking their emotions up and denying their existence is killing them. It is literally killing them in the thousands. And I'm not here to talk about, you know, the epidemic of male suicide in the West, because that is a whole talk in itself. But these old toxic ideas of men being men isn't just dangerous for women, it's deadly for men themselves. Thankfully, we are moving on. You know, things are changing. We've got a long way to go. But if you compare the general attitudes about masculinity found in today's teenagers to those amongst baby boomers, or even, you know, when we were teenagers, okay, maybe we're slightly different age groups. When I was a teenager, you know, you'll be thankful for the differences, but still we do have some way to go. But, you know, perhaps I'm preaching to the choir. You know, how do we encourage our peers to open up, and how do we create these safer, more open environments? And I wouldn't claim that these are, you know, peer-reviewed research findings. These are just the ramblings of a guy who was once much more of a closed book and is now more connected to myself and those around me. And I've seen it in others and hopefully helped them along the way too, both in personal and professional settings. But I think the single most helpful thing for me when I was practicing being more open and allowing myself to be vulnerable was being around other men who were willing to do the same. And for me, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly, it did need to be men. It was really important to me. And if you want your male friends or anyone really to feel more comfortable talking about their mental health, then show them that you're comfortable talking about yours, even if you're pretending. You know, some really significant interactions for me. My big, strong brother talking about his mental health, it changed my life. And I really thought if he can feel like that, anyone can. And if he can talk about it, so can I. And my best friend, the cool, collected ladies' man, telling me about the times he's felt so overwhelmed with the stresses of life that he's ended up in tears. I was like, oh yeah, sometimes I feel like crying too, but that's okay. And I didn't see him any differently because I know who he is. It didn't change anything I thought about him, at least not for the negative. And also, when I've allowed myself to cry, I felt so much better afterwards. I mean, a little random bit of trivia about me. I once went 9 years without so much as shedding a single tear. And when I finally did, it was amazing. Like, yeah, I was sad at the time, but God, that was so gratifying. And I am kind of oversimplifying things for the sake of the point. You know, it's not necessarily an instant switch that flips in your head, although it can be, particularly if you really respect that person. And with these two situations, it kind of was pretty instant, but these experiences can start a chain reaction and can really help things begin to move. And I think more generally, just be an option. If you make it clear that you are someone that people can be open with, that's a big deal. You know, in a workplace or on a sports team, advertise yourself as that person. If anyone needs a chat, give me a shout. You know, we all go through the same sort of cycles in terms of times of year. You know, like second term, everyone hates second term, and in first term it gets to about November and everyone's having a crap time. You know, if you're aware of these sort of cycles, these periods, you know, if anyone needs a chat, give me a shout. Talk about mental health in general, just for the sake of making it a topic of conversation. Ask friends, colleagues, teammates how they're doing. Ask twice. There's a great time to change campaign about how important it is to ask twice, because when we ask how you're doing once, it's tantamount to saying hi. It doesn't really mean how are you. It's just a greeting, and often we don't even wait for an answer. But asking twice is what makes it a real question. It's kind of like asking, but how are you really, without being as dramatic. Make appropriately timed callbacks to passing comments. If someone is meeting up with you and says, you know, sorry, I'm running late, I'm having the worst day, or a teammate isn't performing their best and apologizes for it, they might say something like, sorry, I'm not quite myself. Don't just say, don't worry about it, it's cool. Ask them what's wrong. And if it's not an appropriate time, do just say, don't worry about it. But then later, perhaps when it's a better time to talk, something like, hey, earlier when you said you're not being yourself, I just wanted to check if there's anything you want to talk about. Encourage someone who you think may need to open up, that if they don't feel comfortable doing so with you, they could consider doing so with someone else with whom they would feel comfortable. And if they don't feel comfortable opening up to anyone who's a part of their lives, then consider opening up to someone who isn't, like a counselor. Counselors and psychotherapists are trained to offer this kind of support, and they don't only need to be they don't need to only be seen as that. And I think, as well as normalizing talking about feelings, we should try to normalize talking to a counselor when we want to talk to someone who doesn't already know about or hold a stake in the situations we're facing. Some of my clients have complex mental health issues or are living through impossibly difficult situations, and some of my clients just want to talk about their life to someone outside of it. Ultimately, though, talking saves lives. And I mentioned earlier about the guys who I see in the counseling room who feel vulnerable after sharing for the first time, but the end result is almost always a positive one. And in my personal life and in my professional life, across various roles in community organizations, at Royal Holloway, at UCL, at Westminster, at Cambridge, I've met so many men who are opening up for the first time. And when I ask them how it felt to do so, the first response is usually, it feels a bit weird, or I feel a bit exposed. Some might feel uncomfortable, but that's usually followed up with, but I actually feel so much better. Talking saves lives, whether in a friendly or a formal setting. And when thinking about sports teams specifically, the thing with sports teams is there isn't really anything quite like them. And I'm sure many of you would agree that when it really comes down to it, there are a few things you can compare to being part of a team. You know, feeling like you are bonded together and connected with others, working alongside them with a common purpose. And the solidarity and camaraderie described in the phrase all for one and one for all, like, to me, that just screams team sport. Not so much Switzerland, who should get a new motto, but like extracurricular support is not frivolous or unimportant when it can have such a huge impact on our lives and well-being. So how funny is it then that we can easily get in our minds that it's not the right atmosphere or environment in which to discuss support and mental health. We can think our teams are too laddie or too jokey or just not the right place, but that belonging and that hugely positive mental impact that can be found in sports teams is so good for us and so important for us that perhaps this actually makes it the perfect place. And it could also be worth me mentioning that I know in teams there can be some infighting here and there, and everyone can't be best friends all the time. But if someone from another team was having a crack, you know you're going to be there for your boys without hesitation. So maybe keep in mind that your teammates could at any time be fighting a battle you can't see. And so they might need your support, just like they'd have if some hockey player from Kings was giving them grief on the pitch. The team will always come together when one is in need, but maybe we need to widen our scope and understanding of when that might be. And so I'm realizing I've gone over a little bit. I'll try and wrap this bit up quickly. So they were all things to do. And I think here's something not to do. Don't expect someone to open up with you if you can never be serious or if you're always making jokes at their expense. I think even if mean jokes are a part of your dynamic, and I know that's common in sports teams, it's also common in corporate environments, but you need to show that it's only a part of your dynamic and it can be turned off in an instant. If someone is going to even consider feeling comfortable being real with you, only turning off the jokes when they open up to you probably isn't enough, because the chances are, if that's the case, they never will. And again, you can demonstrate yourself as someone who can be real, even if joking is your natural state, by getting real about yourself and your own struggles. And popularity is a weird concept, which, like I said earlier, it means less and less as you grow up. But if I could sort of make a brief comment about popularity, I think although it doesn't happen in every peer group, it's not uncommon for there to be this one person or a couple of people who are sort of like the glue. People might jokingly or unjokingly refer to them as the leader, or that person that people are more likely to go along with, to follow or be influenced by. The kind of person who, if they can't make an event, then the others might move it, because it's inconceivable that it could go ahead without them. And like I said, this doesn't happen everywhere, but we might know those people, or we might be those people. And I think if this is you, or you suspect it might be, to use that. If you can put the topic of mental health on the table, knowing that people will then think it's okay to talk about it, if you do, then do it. Or if, on the other hand, you have the ear of this person, because we know that the person who can influence many can very often have that one person who can directly influence them, then use that too. And then when the time comes, make it easier. Do something at the same time, go for a walk, hit a ball around. There's something really comforting about being side by side with someone when you're opening up with them. Equally, having a physical distraction can make it feel like talking about your mental health is part of a wider activity rather than a terrifying spotlight. And people can sometimes be surprised at how much they're willing to share while they were punching boxing pads or playing catch with a rugby ball. Offer time. If you only have 5 minutes, offer it, but then suggest the two of you, or however many of you, set aside a time to catch up and have a longer chat. Accept vulnerability and don't mishandle it. You don't need to be qualified counselors. You just need to be accepting and patient and gentle with people's feelings. And if someone shares something difficult, just be sensitive. I'd say assume it's confidential unless told otherwise, or of course, unless you're worried about someone's safety. And move towards vulnerability rather than away from it. Don't try and change the subject if someone's talking about something difficult. Don't tell someone not to be upset or say, you don't mean that. Instant conversation, shut down that one. Don't recoil from someone's feelings, but welcome them. And I think I do mean that figuratively, but also physically. Physically putting distance between you and someone else when they're sharing difficult feelings can feel like rejection, even when it's not. And when they're at their most vulnerable, let them know that they're still accepted. A hug, a slap on the back, a one-arm squeeze around the shoulder. I think physical reassurance right at the moment that someone may be most fearful of rejection can be an incredible comfort. And listen without judgment, because it can be hard enough sharing as it is. Don't try to fix things unless they want your help doing so. And don't make things about you, but at the same time, you can share as a brief acknowledgement to normalize feelings if it seems appropriate. You know, I'm not going to make this about me, but if it helps to reassure you that I'm not going to judge you, I've struggled with X, Y, Z in the past too. Perhaps then they'll ask what helped you, and that could be a cue to offer suggestions if you have some. And I think, you know, thank people for sharing. People always thank me for listening, but sharing is so much harder. And thank you for feeling, you know, saying something. And finally, of course, look after yourself, because you can't pour from an empty cup, and you're not going to be much help to anyone if you're barely functioning yourself. And just as it can help to set an example and demonstrate opening up, I think also set an example of looking after yourself and seeking support when you need it is really, really important. Again, just normalizing that. So yeah, so I have gone on too long, but I suppose my quick rundown conclusion would be, or, you know, genuine human connection is everything. Vulnerability, scary but wonderful. And it's not just a gift we give to others. More importantly, being vulnerable is a gift to ourselves. Recognizing that our vulnerabilities and being vulnerable is a great strength. You know, and we want to help others recognize that about themselves too. Normalize feelings as both a topic of conversation and as real things that exist. Be open with others and be the person others can be open to. Move towards emotional people rather than away from them. If a friend doesn't want to open up to you, encourage them to open up to someone else. Normalize therapy as well, or at the very least remind them they can keep it a secret if they really want to. No one needs to know that anyone's having therapy. Ask people how they are twice. Listen without judgment. Don't try and fix unless you're asked for help doing so. And I do want to, having spent very little time talking about it, I do want to, of course, reiterate looking after yourself as well. And that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kenny. Honestly, it's a real shame we're not in person, because obviously I'm sure you'd be getting a massive round of applause right now, but I'm sure I speak for everyone when I said that was very enjoyable, but much more so many important things that we need to digest, and I'm sure will come up in questions. So what we're going to do now, just to give you the time to digest the talk, think of questions, get yourself a drink, or, you know, do whatever you need to do. We're just going to turn our cameras off for 2 minutes, have a quick break, and then when we come back, either raise your hand or pop your question in the chat or message one of us, and hopefully we can keep the discussion going. So see you in 2 minutes. Okay, great. So we've got kind of 15 minutes now or so for any questions you might have. So yeah, as I say, either pop them in the chat or raise your hand, and I will try and see if I can find participants. Okay. But perhaps in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for those to come through, Kenny, there was one thing that came up towards the end when you were talking about opening yourself up and being there for your friends. And I was just wondering, obviously, as ever with these kind of talks, this year is quite different. It's more difficult to have those interactions in person. So is there anything extra that we can do, like either individually or as a club, or things that from your experience have worked online that could have, if not the same effect, but at least, you know, a similarly positive one?
It's a really good question. And I think there's probably a few things that could be helpful. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not the same, and it is harder to have these conversations. But I think one thing that can be really, really helpful is being that friend who just drops a message. I think we all know that person. Or maybe, you know, some of us are that person. I know, unfortunately, I'm not. I'm terrible at reaching out to people, you know, on WhatsApp or whatever it is. But when I'm reached out to, I'm so aware of how beneficial it is and how helpful it is to have a friend say, hey, how are you doing? And I think we spent so much time online and so much time on our phones, you know, this last year, that for now somebody to reach out of the blue and say, hey, how are you? It doesn't seem like oh, this is a pointless small talk conversation. It feels real. And that sort of thing I think is really useful, you know, and this is advice for myself as much as anyone, but to be that friend, you know, be that friend that reaches out and just asks people how they're getting on. I think as a club, I mean, and I think when it comes to, you know, if you're still having sort of Zoom calls with friends and stuff, again, you know, just being making it a topic of conversation, because I think it's something perhaps now more than ever, although our interaction is very different to how it is usually. I think now more than ever, people are probably willing to talk about how they're feeling, because everyone's I mean, a lot of people are feeling not exactly 100% at the moment. I've certainly noticed, you know, friends who would never usually talk about this stuff, talking about it more at the moment because of the situation we're in. And there's something about this third lockdown that really seems to be the icing on the crab cake, when, you know, the first one was almost enjoyable for some reason. You know, it was new and exciting. We were trying all sorts of different things. And the second one, you know, it was just November, it was all right. But this third one in January and February has been definitely not a lot of people's favorite. So I think in those situations, again, just normalizing it as a topic of conversation when you're chatting to friends, either in a group or on your own. And I think in terms of the hockey club, I mean, for a start, things like this is great. You know, it's great that this is, you know, again, putting that topic of conversation on the table. And I think as well, perhaps making an opportunity for socializing, the kind of things like, you know, I don't know, at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday, amongst the work that we'll all be doing or something, we're going to log on at this time, and if anyone wants to pop in for a chat, then do so. Because I think what that can really be helpful for are those people who might actually not have a huge amount of social contact, but for whom, you know, the hockey club is everything. Or, you know, when I was at uni, when I was at uni, I played a bit of American football, and I was in like some musical groups. And there were people in that group who had lots of friends, and there were people in that group for whom that group were their only friends. And I think particularly for those people, you know, we want to keep them in mind, considering how isolating this time is, and be like, you know, this is going to be a time when the men's hockey club are going to get together for a chat. Just giving them, yeah, that social opportunity.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, yeah, that kind of tees us up nicely. I know Andy's organised, I guess, not more informal, but just for club members on Friday to do that. So hopefully, yeah, that's something for anyone that's listening, or whoever listens later on, because this is being recorded, to join in this Friday. But yeah, we've got a few questions in the chat then. So I'll read out the first one. Hi, Kenny. Do you wish that somebody had pushed you to talk about your innermost feelings earlier, or was it more important that opening up was normalized to you first?
Again, I really, really like that question. I think opening up being normalized for me was something that happened a long time before I opened up. You know, the idea of talking about feelings was something that I'd become quite comfortable with, perhaps somewhat related to, you know, the friends I kept or whatever, but also I think, you know, after that moment when I was 14, that for me, you know, that real light bulb moment about empathy, I think sort of how I presented myself and tried to present myself to my friends from that point, I think it led to a lot of conversations about this stuff. So it almost felt normal to me. But what I didn't realize was that I wasn't sharing. It was almost like, you know, that person who turns up to a picnic where people are like, you know, bringing and sharing food, and they don't bring anything, and they eat a lot, and then they leave, and they're like, yeah, we put in a good spread today. Like I was that friend without realizing. Like I was always talking about mental health. It just wasn't my own. And I think in terms of, do I wish someone had pushed me to talk about my innermost feelings earlier? I think yes. I think even it might have felt strange, and it might have felt uncomfortable that, you know, earlier in my life, it's really hard for me to say maybe I would have been scared to do it. But I think what I had wished earlier, I wish I had realized earlier, was that I wasn't doing it, because I actually thought I was. So yeah, I do wish that someone had pushed me, but I think, yeah, I don't know, it just didn't happen. I grew up in a household where I've seen my dad cry once in his life, and that was literally one single tear. And that was at the televised viewing of George Best's funeral. Like I can't even understand, how that made him cry. I think it was when Josh Groban was singing "You Raise Me Up." But I was with him when he found out his mum had died, and there's so many emotional situations. But I think, yeah, perhaps I don't know, it just didn't seem normal to me. So yeah, no, I think you're right, actually. I do wish it had been normalized. Perhaps it felt normal to talk about mental health, but for some reason, yeah, not to talk about it myself or my own mental health.
Brilliant. We've got 2 more questions in here. The first one is, what do you do if someone who lacks empathy or doesn't take it seriously? Or hang on, or maybe we'll go for the first one. How do you deal with the situation where people who lack empathy with someone trying to open up?
To be honest, I don't really think that there is a whole lot you can do. So if I've understood that correctly, is it asking, how can you manage somebody trying to open up when the person they're trying to open up to isn't taking it seriously?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't phrase that very well.
That's okay.
I was trying to get the question. So take the example. I don't know, you're at training, for example, and somebody kind of seems down, and they're talking to somebody about it, but the person they're talking to is kind of, I don't know, not in the right frame of mind or not taking it seriously.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point, and actually, something that it's not hard to believe that we might see a lot of that. And I think if you know that person, if you know the person that is opening up, perhaps if you can sort of add yourself to that conversation, and not take over and not sort of say, hey, do you want to talk to me instead? Because this guy's clearly not the right person for you to be talking to. And not saying to the person who is not being particularly helpful, not calling them out in front of that person or in the open, unless it's something that they do, quite intentionally and often and perhaps even maliciously, because then that is something that needs to be called out. But in sort of a normal situation, I think perhaps if you add yourself to that conversation and you become that supportive voice, it can either change the conversation entirely, perhaps help that person who was originally being opened up to realize that actually this is a serious conversation, or it just gives that person the option to talk to somebody else, like namely you. And if you are someone that they might feel comfortable talking to, then great. You can do that during the conversation. If it doesn't go on too long and it doesn't seem too sort of damaging, you can wait until after the conversation. But if that person who is the one being opened up to is actually a really good friend, someone you can sort of pull aside, then again, doing it that way and being like, actually, mate, I think he's actually quite, I think he's actually having a bit of a rough time at the moment. And I get that you want to make jokes, but I'm not sure that's particularly helpful right now. And I think things like that can be really, really scary to say. But if it is someone you're really close with, if it is somebody that you can say that to, then that could be helpful. But I think hopefully that presents a few different options depending on your level of sort of relationship with both people in that conversation. But if all else fails, just adding a third person, yourself, to that conversation maybe.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll go for this final question here. So Ilya says, that was a very, very helpful talk and lots of insights gained. What would you say to the sports club presidents, captains here to identify people in their team struggling with mental health, especially those that always seem like they're super happy and always in a good mood? They can easily be overlooked. And even if someone asks about them, they find it hard to open up as they're known for being the happy one or always laughing.
Yeah. Again, really important important stuff, and we've all seen this. It definitely happens. In terms of the club presidents and the captains, identifying those people, I think ultimately it's not always, depending on how well you know someone and depending on how likely you are to notice a change or notice difficulty, it's not always possible to identify those people. But I think, again, making it as comfortable and accessible as possible for them to identify themselves. And look, we're aware of this stuff. We know that there are those people in our clubs, in our teams, in our classes, whatever it is, that they're always, they're known for being the happy one, and they're the joker, and they always have to be happy, and it would be, almost like the world's turned upside down if they were the ones that were upset and needed help. But knowing that, I think, again, that's something that we can, in a sense, normalize the idea that everyone can struggle. And earlier when I was saying about, be that person that says, if anyone needs to chat, give me a shout. You can't force people to talk to you, but I guess you can just hopefully make it seem as much a realistic option as possible. And I don't have any sort of miracle answers in terms of how you can identify those people that, sort of keep it to themselves and fool us all, because they exist as well, people who completely fool us, and we find out they're struggling, and it does absolutely, blow our minds. But I really think, just falling back on this idea that if we make ourselves as available as possible, if we make mental health as normal a topic as possible, sometimes perhaps if we just explicitly say, please talk to one of us. There might be a couple of people in your team, even designated people, please talk to us if you need to talk to someone, or if you want any advice about, where to go with particular issues. Hopefully that can help.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, we've come to 6 now, but I think that was a very productive discussion. So firstly, thanks everyone for coming, even if you were just listening. I'm sure you've learned a lot today, and especially thank you to the people who asked their questions. But I have to say again, thank you so much, Kenny. I know, well, personally, I've learned a lot. I'm sure, pretty much everyone here has as well. And just a quick reminder, so Friday as well, it'll be on our social media accounts, which is at UCLMHC. We'll be having what Kenny talks about, just a kind of small discussion, hopefully to pick up some of the ideas you've talked about here and take them forward as a club. But thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your evenings.